It started with a question I never expected. On a quiet Sunday afternoon while watering my garden, I noticed Liam, my neighbor's 22-year-old son, sitting on his porch, visibly upset. He looked up, hesitated, then asked, "Do you think people ever really stop loving someone, even after everything goes wrong?" I paused, surprised by the depth of the question. "Sometimes. I think the love stays, but people bury it," I replied. He nodded slowly, like he had been waiting for someone to say that. I didn't think much of it at first, but days turned into weeks and we began talking more. At first, it was always by chance, me outside tending plants, him walking the dog. Then it wasn't by chance anymore. We'd sit on the porch steps after dusk, sharing stories, thoughts, frustrations. He spoke of his parents' divorce, of never feeling enough. I spoke vaguely about my marriage, how it had become more functional than emotional. My husband and I had grown into polite roommates who shared space, not hearts. With Liam, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, seen. He listened, not out of obligation, but curiosity. He asked about my dreams, my regrets, what made me laugh, and what I feared. It was intoxicating. I told myself it was harmless. After all, I was old enough to be his mother. Well, almost. But the age difference did nothing to dissolve the emotional electricity that slowly started crackling between us. One night, during a power outage, we sat in candlelight on my back porch. The world around us was dark, but between us, something was glowing. He looked at me and said, "You deserve to be loved out loud." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was tight with guilt, but my heart, it beat with something else. That night we didn't touch, but my dreams did. The emotional affair was in full bloom before I even realized what had happened. I thought about him when I made dinner, when I folded laundry, when I lay beside my husband. I began anticipating our interactions. I dressed differently. I felt alive and ashamed for feeling alive. The kiss came 2 weeks later. I had just returned from grocery shopping when Liam offered to help carry the bags inside. It was raining, lightly, and everything felt surreal. As I reached to take the last bag from him, our hands brushed and something inside me broke. Or maybe it awakened. He leaned in, hesitant but honest, and kissed me. It wasn't lustful. It was careful, full of emotion we hadn't named, and I kissed him back. That kiss changed everything. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Guilt consumed me. I avoided Liam for days, ignored his texts, locked the gate between our yards. My marriage, already fragile, began to crack under the weight of my silence. My husband noticed my absence, not physically, but emotionally. And he asked the question I feared, "Is there someone else?" I didn't answer, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't know how to explain what someone else meant. I hadn't fallen into an affair out of desire, but out of starvation, for connection, for intimacy, for feeling like I mattered. Liam's family moved. His mother took a job across the country, and he went with her. We never spoke again, but I still think about him, about how something that never should have happened ended up revealing everything I had been missing. I didn't leave my marriage, but I couldn't pretend it was whole anymore. Counseling followed, honest conversations, painful rebuilding. Infidelity isn't always loud. Sometimes it's whispered through shared glances, lingering questions, and unspoken emotional dependence. Sometimes it begins with someone simply asking, "Do you think people ever really stop loving someone?" His story unfolds from an unexpected, quiet moment, a question from a neighbor's son that seemed simple on the surface but held emotional weight far beyond its phrasing. Do you think people ever really stop loving someone, even after everything goes wrong? It was a deeply personal inquiry, especially coming from someone so young, and yet it pierced through the protagonist's carefully maintained emotional defenses. In that question lay a sense of longing, grief, and confusion, echoes of feelings she had tried to silence within herself. The moment didn't scream danger, it didn't resemble the beginnings of betrayal. But emotionally, something shifted. This question, so raw, so intimate, was not merely a reflection of the young man's inner conflict. It mirrored the silent ache the protagonist had buried for years. And from that instant, emotional curiosity was ignited quietly, like the first spark in a long, forgotten fire. What began as a neighborly interaction quickly took on a subtle intensity. The protagonist, caught in a marriage dulled by routine and emotional distance, found herself drawn to the honesty and vulnerability of the boy next door. He was not just her neighbor's son, he was someone whose emotional openness contrasted sharply with the guarded, stale conversations she was used to at home. His willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, to speak from his pain, awakened something dormant inside her. It wasn't attraction in the traditional sense, it was resonance. For the first time in years, someone seemed interested in her interior world, not just the roles she played. Mother, wife, homemaker. That emotional interest, once sparked, became magnetic. It created a bridge between them that felt safer than it should have, more intimate than anyone around them could see. Their encounters remained outwardly innocent. Brief conversations over fences, casual waves, shared observations about the weather. But underneath those mundane exchanges was a current of emotional electricity. Every new question he asked chipped away at her detachment. He asked about her dreams, about her favorite childhood memory, about the last time she cried for herself and not someone else. These weren't flirtations, they were invitations, each one peeling back a layer of her emotional armor, and she responded not out of desire to betray, but out of a deep hunger to be seen. She began sharing things she hadn't spoken aloud in years, things even her husband didn't know. That vulnerability, offered and returned, became the foundation of a bond neither had intended to build. What made the connection dangerous wasn't the age gap or the proximity. It was the emotional validation. It's easy to condemn physical infidelity because it's visible, tangible. But emotional affairs are murky, often beginning in such subtle ways that even those involved don't realize where they're headed. That was the case here. The protagonist didn't seek out emotional intimacy outside her marriage. It came in through a side door she hadn't thought to lock. Emotional curiosity became a lifeline for her, a way to remember who she used to be before life became a series of responsibilities and quiet disappointments. Each conversation with Liam, no matter how benign it seemed, left an imprint. She felt more alive, more real, in those moments than in entire weeks with her husband. The dynamic between them began to evolve, shaped by shared silences and unspoken truths. They would sit together on porches during dusky evenings, not needing to fill every moment with words. Sometimes he would look at her as if searching for answers she couldn't give. Other times, she'd find herself stealing glances, wondering how she ended up here, on the edge of something forbidden, yet emotionally intoxicating. The age difference created a sense of taboo, but it also gave her a reason to deny the connection to herself. He's just a kid, she'd think, even as she looked forward to their next exchange more than any interaction with her husband. Emotional curiosity morphed into emotional dependency. She found herself thinking about Liam's questions long after their conversations ended, replaying them in her mind while cooking dinner, folding clothes, or lying in bed beside a man who no longer reached for her. It's in this emotional landscape that infidelity often takes root, not in grand gestures or explicit advances, but in the quiet, slow erosion of boundaries. The protagonist didn't realize she was walking toward betrayal. She only knew that someone had finally asked her something personal, and had listened. That was the true beginning, not of the affair itself, but of the emotional displacement that made the affair possible. Emotional curiosity, when offered by someone outside the committed relationship, can become a doorway. For some, it's a wake-up call. For others, it becomes a second life, a parallel emotional reality that feels more authentic than the one they're officially living. In this story, it was the question, not the kiss, that started it all, and sometimes that's all it takes. Emotional infidelity often arrives disguised in innocence, an accidental closeness, a harmless bond, a friendship that deepens when no one is looking. In this story, the relationship between the protagonist and Liam, her neighbor's son, was built not on flirtation or seduction, but on shared vulnerability. It wasn't physical touch that broke the boundaries first, but the slow, consistent pouring of emotional intimacy into each other's lives. They became confidants before they became anything else. Their conversations were not explicit, but they were revealing, deep, meaningful, and layered with trust. In the absence of physicality, their emotional connection bloomed in the shadows, unnoticed by the outside world but undeniable to them. And it's this very form of intimacy, private, non-physical, and powerful, that often cuts the deepest. Emotional infidelity doesn't require skin. It requires presence, understanding, and the kind of availability that should be reserved for the person we've promised ourselves to. The protagonist, emotionally estranged in her marriage, began to rely on Liam for comfort and affirmation. Her husband, though present, had become a ghost in their shared home, a man of habit rather than heart. The lack of emotional dialogue in her marriage had long since become normalized, a silent agreement that neither of them dared to challenge. But Liam's presence disrupted that silence. He asked her about things her husband hadn't asked in years. He noticed when she changed her hair, when she seemed tired, when her voice carried sadness. His attention was effortless, not performative, and in that attentiveness, she rediscovered the experience of being emotionally acknowledged. It wasn't about being desired, it was about being seen. That difference is what made her lean in rather than pull away. She found herself opening up more and more, telling Liam things she hadn't admitted even to herself, much less to her spouse. These weren't just conversations. They were confessions, wrapped in casual words and subtle looks. With each exchange, the boundary between emotional support and emotional dependence grew thinner. She began to look forward to their encounters with the kind of anticipation that once belonged to her partner. Emotional fidelity requires not only physical monogamy, but also the protection of deep connection, something sacred reserved for the relationship that is supposed to hold your heart. But her heart had started to shift its weight. It leaned toward the one who asked about her inner world rather than the one who shared her bed. And even though nothing physical had yet happened, her emotional loyalty had quietly migrated. She justified it by telling herself there was no affair, no intimacy, no secret meetings behind closed doors. But what she couldn't admit was that she had begun to emotionally prioritize someone else. There's a particular danger in emotional infidelity because it allows people to live in denial longer than they would if the betrayal were physical. The absence of a kiss, a touch, a bedroom gives the illusion that boundaries are still intact. But emotional intimacy, especially the kind that flourishes in secrecy, often signals a deeper fracture. It isn't built on lust, but on longing. Longing for connection, for validation, for the feeling of being essential to someone's emotional life. Liam became that person for her, and she for him. He too was wrestling with unresolved pain, his parents' divorce, his struggle with abandonment, his need to feel safe with someone. She became his emotional anchor, and he became her mirror. In each other's eyes, they found not just solace but meaning. They didn't need to touch to cross the line. The line had already vanished in the silences that said more than any words could. The secrecy that formed around their bond deepened its intimacy. No one else knew the things they shared. No one else was allowed into that emotional space, and that secrecy wasn't just about protecting the relationship. It was part of what made it feel so vital. Forbidden connections often feel more intense precisely because they exist outside the rules. The protagonist told herself they were only talking, but those talks replaced the late, night conversations she once had with her husband. Liam became the one she wanted to tell her good news to, the one whose opinion mattered most. That shift where someone else becomes your emotional reference point is a betrayal of intimacy, even if it never becomes sexual. Her marriage had lost its emotional pulse, and Liam unknowingly became the defibrillator. The truth is, emotional affairs don't start in bedrooms. They start in glances that linger too long, in texts that feel a little too thoughtful, in conversations that go a little too deep. And by the time you realize what's happening, the heart has already crossed over, dragging your conscience behind it. In this story, the emotional affair wasn't less harmful than a physical one. It was more complicated, more insidious. It left no bruises, no visible aftermath, but it changed everything. Trust, once fractured emotionally, is far harder to restore than physical fidelity, because the question that remains is not did you sleep with someone else, but why did you need someone else to feel understood? That kind of betrayal leaves echoes that linger long after the silence returns. The protagonist's descent into emotional infidelity was not marked by lust or premeditated deceit, but by a slow, burning internal conflict, a quiet war between what she felt and what she believed she was supposed to feel. As her bond with Liam deepened, she began to experience a kind of intimacy that she hadn't realized she'd been starved of for years. It wasn't sexual desire that consumed her, but emotional recognition, being heard, being seen, being understood in ways that had become foreign in her marriage. This subtle emotional connection triggered a cascade of unspoken longings she had buried beneath the rituals of daily life, preparing dinner, managing a home, exchanging short, functional conversations with her husband. Her body remained in the house, but her emotional landscape shifted, tilted by the gravitational pull of a young man who, despite the complications, made her feel more whole than the man she'd pledged her life to. She didn't plan to think about Liam when she went to bed at night. She didn't mean to wait for the sound of his footsteps outside. But her thoughts betrayed her, traveling to him during the quietest parts of her day, the moments when no one was asking her how she felt, what she needed, or whether she was happy. It wasn't just attraction, it was comfort. His presence made her feel like she was allowed to be herself, stripped of the expectations that had calcified her identity as a wife. And yet, every time her mind wandered to him, she felt a piercing stab of guilt. She told herself nothing inappropriate had happened. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she couldn't deny that she was emotionally dependent on someone who wasn't her husband. The inner turmoil began to unravel her from within, one thread at a time. The hardest part wasn't hiding the feelings from her husband. It was hiding them from herself. She'd catch herself smiling at a message from Liam and quickly dismiss the joy, chalking it up to the novelty of someone simply listening. She would relive conversations with him while sitting across the dinner table from the man she married, nodding absent-mindedly as he spoke about his day. The more emotionally distant she became from her husband, the more clarity she gained about what she had been missing. But clarity did not bring peace. It brought confusion, shame, and a slow building panic. Her guilt wasn't about betrayal alone. It was about the dawning realization that she was emotionally anchored to someone outside her marriage, and she didn't know how, or if she wanted to let go. Liam, in contrast, was unguarded in his emotions. His honesty and vulnerability dismantled her defenses. He didn't play the role of a seducer or try to exploit her unhappiness. He was simply present, emotionally available in a way that invited her to be the same. That openness became dangerously addictive. She found herself craving the space he created, a space where she didn't have to perform, explain, or suppress. It felt pure, almost innocent, even though she knew, deep down, that the emotional closeness they shared was crossing a line. Each day that passed without addressing the growing tension inside her made the situation more volatile. She lived in a dual reality, one where she was a loyal wife fulfilling her duties, and another where she was a woman emotionally entangled in a connection that gave her life color and contrast again. The most agonizing moments were not the ones spent with Liam, but the ones in between, when she was alone with her thoughts, replaying every conversation, every glance, every almost touch. The fear of being discovered mingled with the fear of being honest with herself. What did it mean to be emotionally unfaithful? Had she already destroyed the trust in her marriage by merely feeling what she felt? Her internal dialogue became relentless. She asked herself whether she was imagining the intensity, whether she was reading too much into his kindness, whether her emotional hunger had distorted her perception. But every time she tried to convince herself that it was nothing, her heart betrayed her with how deeply it had already invested in the connection. Her mind became a battlefield where desire, shame, and logic fought for dominance. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling beside her sleeping husband, wondering how something that felt so emotionally fulfilling could be so morally wrong. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She didn't want to tear apart her marriage, but the longer she stayed silent, the more trapped she felt, caught between two versions of herself, the one who honored her vows and the one who finally felt alive. That division within her grew sharper with every passing day, and the emotional conflict became unbearable. She started questioning everything: her marriage, her identity, her own moral compass. The truth is, emotional infidelity doesn't happen in a single moment. It unfolds slowly through a series of compromises we make with our own conscience, until we find ourselves standing in a place we never thought we'd reach, holding feelings we never thought we'd have, and carrying guilt we don't know how to set down. The collapse of boundaries in emotional affairs often doesn't come with fireworks or dramatic ultimatums. It unravels quietly, moment by moment, until the difference between what's right and what feels right becomes indistinguishably blurred. For the protagonist, that moment arrived not with intention but with vulnerability. The emotional intimacy she had been building with Liam had always felt suspended in an unspoken agreement. Close, but not too close, intense, but not physical. But emotional affairs are fragile things. They exist in a space where longing grows in silence, and the pressure of secrecy eventually demands release. When Liam kissed her, it wasn't a premeditated act. It wasn't passion in the traditional sense. It was the culmination of dozens of quiet exchanges, lingering glances, and unmet emotional needs finally overflowing into action. That single kiss broke the emotional contract she had convinced herself they could maintain. And once that boundary crumbled, the weight of everything that came before, and everything that would follow, crashed down on her with brutal force. The moment itself was brief. It didn't happen in a bedroom or behind locked doors, but in the blurred spaces of everyday life. A rainy afternoon, shared groceries, idle conversation that suddenly took on a weight neither of them could carry anymore. It was one of those moments where reality bends just long enough to let impulse take over, and then snaps back into place with overwhelming clarity. The kiss wasn't wild or urgent. It was gentle, filled with emotion more than desire. But it was enough to shift everything from the realm of thought to reality, enough to remove the veil of plausible deniability, enough to force her to confront what she had been dancing around all along. She had fallen into something she couldn't name, and now she couldn't ignore it. What followed wasn't exhilaration. It was chaos, emotional chaos, psychological chaos, the kind that swallows you whole before you can even scream. She withdrew almost immediately, both physically and emotionally, from Liam. The gate between their homes remained locked. She avoided the garden, turned off porch lights, changed routines, but avoidance did nothing to erase what had happened. If anything, it made it more real. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was loud with guilt and confusion. Her thoughts turned obsessive. She questioned every decision, every conversation leading up to that moment, wondering how she let it go so far. The very connection that had once made her feel alive now became a source of torment. What had once been a safe emotional escape now became a burden she carried alone. Inside her home, the consequences rippled. Her husband noticed changes, not in action but in energy. She was more distant, more distracted, less engaged. The emotional absence that had once gone unnoticed now stood out, sharp and undeniable. He began to ask questions. Nothing accusatory, just concerned, but even his concern made her ache because it came too late. It felt like trying to revive something already dead. When he finally asked if there was someone else, she didn't know how to answer. How do you explain a betrayal that was never meant to happen? How do you articulate the kind of intimacy that doesn't leave lipstick stains or hotel receipts, but still shatters trust like glass? The aftermath wasn't just about broken boundaries. It was about identity collapse. She had always seen herself as loyal, honest, grounded, but now she had to look in the mirror and see someone capable of emotional betrayal, someone who kissed a boy young enough to be her son's friend, someone who let herself be pulled into a story she couldn't control. That realization was devastating. It didn't just threaten her marriage, it threatened her sense of self. She couldn't simply undo what had happened. There was no reverse gear. The kiss had happened. The emotional intimacy had happened. And now the truth was something she had to carry whether she chose to confess or conceal. Her relationship with Liam disintegrated not because of anger or shame, but because there was no longer a safe space for it to exist. The emotional territory they once shared had become a battlefield, and they were both wounded. Liam left soon after. His mother's job offered the perfect out. And while they never spoke again, his absence didn't erase the emotional damage. It magnified it. She was left with a crumbling marriage, a head full of questions, and a heart split between remorse and yearning. The silence between her and her husband was no longer peaceful. It was unbearable. They began counseling not because they wanted to save something beautiful, but because they were desperate to salvage what remained. The fallout of emotional infidelity often leaves no tangible wreckage, but its ruins are deeply internal. It leaves people questioning not only their relationships, but their moral compass, their emotional needs, their hidden loneliness. The protagonist didn't walk away unscathed. She walked away heavier, with the weight of secrecy, regret, and the unsettling knowledge that love, once redirected, changes everything it touches. Emotional boundaries, once crossed, don't just affect one connection. They disrupt entire ecosystems of trust, identity, and belonging. And what begins as a seemingly innocent conversation can unravel a life built on fragile silence.